My name is Sarah Whitfield, and I'm 29 years old. I was sitting in my car outside a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, on the night my father called to remind me I was still their daughter, whether I liked it or not. I had just left the ICU waiting room after a 12-hour shift, my scrubs still smelling like antiseptic, my hands shaking from low blood sugar and no sleep. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and I saw the name that still made my stomach tighten after all these years. Dad. I almost didn't answer. I answered anyway because some habits take longer to break than the years they were built in. Sarah, he said. No hello, no how are you? Your mother's insulin copay went up again. We need $300 by Friday. I told him I couldn't, not this month. My own rent had just gone up too. There was a pause. Then his voice went cold in that specific way I knew from childhood, the tone that meant the conversation was already over before it started. You've always been selfish, he said. Ever since you left, this family has struggled, and you sit there in your nice apartment pretending you don't know why. He hung up before I could respond. I sat in that dark parking lot for 11 minutes without moving. Because 2 days earlier, my cousin Priya had sent me a screenshot from a family group chat I wasn't in. A group chat where my mother had written, word for word, that nobody had heard from me in months, that she feared something had happened to me, that she'd even asked a neighbor to check if my old apartment building had any record of me. I hadn't moved. I hadn't disappeared. I had simply stopped sending money 4 years ago, and somewhere in that silence, my parents had built a story that made me the villain and themselves the victims. On my kitchen table at home, there was already a folder waiting. One I had started keeping 8 months earlier, without fully admitting to myself why. Bank transfers, voicemails, screenshots. A business card from an attorney I hadn't called yet, but had already met with once, just to ask what my options were. I didn't know that night that within 6 weeks, that folder would end a decades-long pattern in my family, and that the truth, once it came out, would cost my parents far more than the money they thought I owed them. But before I tell you what happened next, and why my parents ended up owing me an apology in front of the entire family instead of the other way around, tell me what time it is right now where you're watching from, and where in the world you're sitting as you press play on this video. If you've ever been the reliable one in your family, the one who gives until there's nothing left, hit subscribe before we go further, because this story is for you. I need you to understand where this started, because the phone call in that parking lot wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment 4 years of silence finally cracked open. I grew up in a small house outside Dayton, Ohio, the older of 2 children. My brother Daniel was 2 years younger than me. And from the time I was 7 years old, I understood without anyone explaining it that the rules in our house were different depending on who you were. When I was 11, I won a regional spelling competition, and my father's first words to me afterward were, "Don't let it go to your head. Daniel needs help with his homework." When Daniel was 13, he broke a neighbor's window with a baseball, and my mother told the neighbor it must have been an accident caused by the other kids on the street, even though there were no other kids on the street that day. I learned early that my job in the family was to be quiet, capable, and useful. Daniel's job was to be forgiven. By the time I was 16, I was babysitting 3 nights a week and handing half my earnings to my mother for groceries, even though I could see the grocery bags from the store that sold name-brand snacks Daniel liked and generic ones for everyone else. I didn't complain. I told myself that's what good daughters do. At 19, I started nursing school on loans and a part-time job at a pharmacy. My parents told relatives I was getting my degree paid for, which wasn't true, but correcting them felt like starting a fight I didn't have the energy for. At 22, 6 months after I got my first nursing job, my father called and said the mortgage was short that month. I sent $400 from my first real paycheck, the one I had planned to use for a used car so I could stop taking 3 buses to work. I took the bus for another 8 months instead. That became the pattern. Every few months there was a new emergency. The car needed a transmission. The roof needed patching. Daniel needed help launching a business, which turned out to be a phone case reselling venture that lasted 4 months and left my parents covering a lease on a storage unit for boxes of unsold inventory. Each time I sent money, and each time, the ask got slightly larger and slightly more entitled in tone, like I owed a debt nobody had ever actually explained to me. There were 3 scenes from those years I still remember clearly, because they were the moments where I almost said, No, and didn't. The first was when I was 23. And I told my mother I wanted to save for my own apartment instead of continuing to send $400 a month. She cried on the phone and said, "So this is what we raised, a daughter who cares more about furniture than her own mother's health." I sent the money. The second was when I was 25, and Daniel wrecked a car my parents had co-signed for him. My father called and said the insurance wouldn't cover the difference and that family helps family even though I hadn't been asked to co-sign anything, hadn't been consulted, and was simply expected to close the gap because I was the one with steady income. I sent the money. The third was the moment everything changed. Though I didn't know it yet. I was 26, working a double shift, and I called my mother just to talk, not about money, just to hear a familiar voice on a hard day. She spent the entire call listing what Daniel needed that month, then said, almost as an afterthought, "You sound tired. Are you eating enough? Actually, never mind. We can talk later. I need to call your brother back." She hung up first. I sat in the nurse's break room and realized something I had been avoiding for years. I had never once, not one single time, been the reason for a phone call in that house. I was only ever the answer to someone else's problem. There was a fourth scene I hadn't let myself think about in years, but it came back to me clearly that night in the parking lot. I was 14, and I had saved birthday money for 8 months to buy a secondhand bicycle from a boy 2 streets over. Chuppy. Morning I finally had enough. My mother took the envelope from my dresser drawer without asking, and used it to buy Daniel a pair of cleats for a soccer season he quit after 3 games. When I asked about it, she said, "You're older. You understand these things. Daniel doesn't." I was 14. I didn't understand anything except that my savings weren't really mine. I never got that bicycle. I walked to school for 2 more years instead, and I never brought it up again because bringing things up in my house rarely changed the outcome. It just extended the conversation. There was also a quieter injury that took me longer to name, one that had nothing to do with money at all. When I graduated nursing school, my parents didn't attend the ceremony because Daniel had a regional soccer tournament that same weekend, and my father said, "You'll have plenty more milestones. He's only got one shot at this." I stood in my cap and gown that day and took a photo with a classmate's family instead, because mine wasn't in the building. I kept that photo on my nightstand for years, not because it made me happy, but because it reminded me what I was capable of building on my own, with or without an audience. That was the year I quietly started saving instead of sending. Not all at once. Not with some dramatic announcement. I started small, telling them I was tight this month, then still catching up from last time, then simply not answering calls that came in on the 1st and 15th of the month. The day's money requests seemed to arrive like clockwork. By the time I was 27, I had stopped sending money almost entirely. I still called on birthdays. I still sent a card at Christmas. I told myself I hadn't cut them off. I had just stopped funding a system that was never going to stop taking. I didn't know during those quiet years of finally breathing that my absence from the family finances was being rewritten into something else entirely, a story about a daughter who vanished, who couldn't be reached, who might be in trouble, a story that made my parents look worried instead of entitled, and made me look unstable instead of simply done. That was the story waiting for me in that parking lot the night my father called about the insulin copay. That was the story I decided, sitting in my car with my hands finally steady, I was going to end. The next morning, I didn't call my parents. I called Priya first because I needed to understand exactly what had been said and to who. Priya told me the group chat wasn't new. For at least 2 years, my mother had periodically posted updates suggesting she hadn't heard from me, that she was worried sick, that she'd asked around about whether anyone had seen me. My Aunt Carol had apparently offered to file a missing persons report at one point, an offer my mother had declined, saying she didn't want to make a scene, which in hindsight told me she knew exactly what she was doing. I asked Priya to send me screenshots of anything she still had. She did, 12 of them, spanning back 19 months, timestamps intact. I started a new folder on my laptop that night, and I labeled it plainly, without drama, the way I label patient charts at work, documentation. Inside it, I began organizing everything I could find. 4 years of bank transfer records showing the money I had sent between the ages of 22 and 26. Proving I had never disappeared financially either, that the relationship had simply changed shape when I stopped being an ATM. Text messages going back years, including the ones from my father calling me selfish, and my mother's message from 6 months earlier that read verbatim, "Must be nice to forget where you came from." Voicemails I had saved without fully knowing why, including one from my mother's number that, when I listened to it again with clearer ears, wasn't worried at all. It was irritated. She sounded annoyed that I wasn't picking up, not afraid that something had happened to me. I also found something I hadn't expected. My old apartment building had a resident portal with a message log, and 8 months earlier, a neighbor named Rita had messaged the building manager asking if the girl in 4C still lived there, saying her mother had asked her to check. I had lived in that unit the entire time. I had simply stopped answering my mother's calls, not stopped existing. The building manager, when I called and explained the situation, was kind enough to email me a copy of that message log with timestamps for my records. There was one discovery that stopped me cold, and I want to walk through it slowly because it's the reason I stopped hesitating about whether documentation was overkill. Going back through old texts, I found a message from my mother, sent almost a year earlier to a cousin I barely knew, saying that she was considering calling the police to do a welfare check on me because I hadn't answered in weeks. I checked my call log from that exact period. My mother had called me twice in 6 weeks, both times about money, both times I had let it go to voicemail because I was working overnight shifts. 2 unanswered calls about money had apparently become, in her retelling, weeks of unexplained silence, serious enough to involve police. I sat with that for a long time because a wellness check isn't nothing. Officers show up at your door, neighbors notice. It becomes a mark on a record somewhere, a story that outlives the moment it was told. I called my local precinct's non-emergency line, gave them the approximate date, and asked whether any welfare check had ever been requested for my address. There had been. One, logged 14 months earlier, requested by a woman identifying herself as my mother, closed as resident confirmed safe and unwilling to engage, after an officer had knocked on my door while I was at a 12-hour shift and a neighbor confirmed I lived there and worked nights. I requested the incident report. It took 9 days and a small records fee, but it arrived with a case number, a date, and an officer's badge number attached to it. That report became the 4th item in my folder, and it was the one that made Denise sit back in her chair when I showed it to her. "This isn't a family disagreement anymore," she said. "This is a pattern with a paper trail. That changes what we can do, and more importantly, it changes what you don't have to feel guilty about doing. I want to be clear about something here because I think it matters. I didn't go looking for a way to hurt my parents. I went looking for the truth, because for the first time in my life, I needed proof of my own reality, since my family had spent years rewriting it for me. There was also a work-related thread I hadn't expected to have to pull on, but it turned out to matter more than I initially realized. A coworker of mine, a fellow nurse named Melissa, mentioned in passing one afternoon that a man matching my father's description had called the hospital's main line a few months earlier, asking whether I still worked there, saying he was trying to locate his daughter for a family emergency. I hadn't known about that call. Nobody had told me because hospital staff routinely field these kinds of requests and rarely think to mention them unless something feels off. I asked our HR department if they kept a log of external inquiries like that, and they did, a simple call log with dates and departments. The entry was there, time-stamped, roughly 11 days after I had stopped answering calls about Daniel's second business attempt. It confirmed something important. My father hadn't been worried about my safety. He had been trying to locate a source of income he assumed would eventually come back online if enough pressure was applied through enough channels. I added the HR log to the folder, not because I planned to use it dramatically, but because it closed a loop. It proved a pattern of behavior that stretched beyond my parents' immediate circle and into my professional life, something I hadn't fully understood was happening until I went looking. Once I had the documentation organized, I did something I had never done before in my life. I called a family law and defamation attorney, a woman named Denise Marsh, who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, cases where families weaponize concern as a form of control. I sat in her office and laid out 4 years of bank records, 2 years of screenshots, and one very telling voicemail. Denise didn't tell me to sue my parents. She told me something more useful. She said, "You don't need to destroy them. You need the truth to exist somewhere they can't erase it. After that, the truth does the rest on its own. She helped me draft 2 things. The first was a formal letter, not a threat, simply a documented timeline of the financial support I had provided between certain years, followed by a clear statement that I had not disappeared, had maintained the same address and phone number the entire time, and that continued statements suggesting otherwise could constitute defamation if repeated to third parties, including potential business or community contacts. Denise also suggested something I hadn't considered, which was reaching out directly to the neighbor, Rita, who had messaged the building manager on my mother's behalf. I called Rita myself gently, without accusation, just to understand what she'd been told. Rita said my mother had called her out of the blue, described me as going through something, and asked if she could quietly check whether I still lived in the building, so she wouldn't have to make it a whole police thing again. That single phrase, again, confirmed something I'd already suspected. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a strategy my mother had used more than once, each time recruiting someone else to lend her story credibility she couldn't earn honestly. Rita, to her credit, apologized for not reaching out to me directly instead, and offered to write a short statement confirming our conversation if I ever needed it. I thanked her and added it to the folder, not because I expected to need it in court, but because I was done being the only person who remembered things accurately. By the time I sat down with Denise for our final meeting before the dinner, my folder had grown from a handful of screenshots into something closer to a case file: 4 years of bank transfers, 2 years of group chat messages, 1 police incident report, a building message log, a written statement from a neighbor, and a summary timeline typed in plain, unembellished language. Denise looked through it one more time and said something I've held on to since. "You didn't build this to win an argument. You built this so you'd never have to argue at all." That's the difference between evidence and emotion. Evidence doesn't need you to raise your voice. The second thing we planned was smaller, but it mattered more to me personally. It was a plan for how I would finally speak, calmly, with evidence, at the one event I knew my entire extended family would be at in 6 weeks. My cousin Priya's engagement. Dinner. The invitation had gone out to nearly 40 relatives. I had not initially been invited, an oversight Priya quietly corrected the moment she found out, telling me, "You're my cousin, not a rumor. Of course you're coming." I decided that dinner would be where the truth finally caught up to the story. In the weeks leading up to the dinner, 2 things happened that confirmed I was making the right decision. The first was that my mother reached out again, this time, not about medical bills, but about Daniel. His third business attempt, an online supplement brand, was failing, and he needed $8,000 to cover a supplier order he had already placed without the money to pay for it. My father's text read, "This is bigger than the usual stuff. Family sticks together in real emergencies. Don't make us regret how we raised you." I didn't respond. I forwarded the message straight into my documentation folder. The second thing that happened was that I finally understood where years of money had actually gone. Through a conversation with Daniel himself, who called me sounding stressed and, for once, honest, I learned that my parents had used a significant portion of what I'd sent over the years, along with money from a home equity line of credit, to fund 3 separate failed businesses for him, plus a down payment on a truck he'd since defaulted on. Daniel wasn't cruel. He was, I think, as caught in the family pattern as I had been, just cast in a different role, the golden child who was never allowed to fail quietly either. He told me, almost apologetically, "They keep telling everyone you went off the grid." I told Mom that's messed up, but you know how she gets. I asked him if he'd be willing to tell the truth if it came up at the dinner. He went quiet for a long moment, then said, "I'm tired of the lying too, Sarah. Yeah, I will." The night of the engagement dinner arrived on a warm evening in early October. The restaurant was a banquet hall my aunt had rented, string lights strung. Across a patio, the smell of grilled food and rosemary drifting from the kitchen. I arrived early, sat near the back, and watched the room fill with relatives I hadn't seen in years, some of whom hugged me with genuine warmth, others who looked at me with a strange, cautious pity that told me exactly what version of my story they'd been fed. My mother saw me from across the room, and her face did something complicated, surprise sliding quickly into performance. She crossed the patio, arms already open, voice pitched loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Sarah, oh my God, you're alive." We've been so worried. Why haven't you called? Why haven't you answered? Do you know what you put us through? Heads turned. A few relatives exchanged glances. I stayed calm. I had rehearsed this moment more times than I wanted to admit. I've had the same phone number for 6 years, Mom, I said evenly. I've had the same address for 4. I've never once been unreachable. Her smile flickered, but she recovered quickly, turning slightly toward my Aunt Carol, who was now watching us. She's always been dramatic, my mother said, half laughing, like this was a joke between old friends. You know how she gets when she feels guilty. That was the moment my father walked over, drink in hand, jaw already tight. You embarrass us tonight, of all nights, at your cousin's dinner? He said, low and sharp. Some things never change. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder I had prepared. Thin, organized, unremarkable looking. The kind of folder nobody would guess held 4 years of a family's undoing. I'm not here to embarrass anyone, I said. I'm here because I'm tired of being the missing daughter in a story I never left. I opened the folder and set 3 printed pages on the table in front of my parents. Not thrown, not dramatic, simply placed. The first page was the message log from my old apartment building, time-stamped, showing my continuous occupancy for the entire period my mother had claimed she couldn't locate me. The second was a printed screenshot of the family group chat, my mother's own words, dated and unedited. The third was a summary Denise had helped me prepare, a clean, dated timeline of over $31,000 I had sent between the ages of 22 and 26, alongside the more recent messages demanding thousands more for Daniel's failing business. I never disappeared, I said quietly. I stopped. Paying. Those are different things, and I think somewhere you both know that. My mother's hand hovered over the papers but didn't touch them, like she was afraid they might be real if she made contact. This is private family business, my father said, his voice dropping, aware now of how many people were within earshot. You don't air this in public. You made it public first, I said. You told 40 people I disappeared. I'm just telling them where I actually was. That was when Daniel stood up from his table. The room had gone quiet enough that his voice carried, without him needing to raise it. She's telling the truth, he said. I know because some of that money went to my business. Mine, not some emergency. I should have said something a long time ago. My mother turned toward him, stunned, mouth opening and closing without sound. Auntie, yeah. Carol, who had once offered to file a missing persons report on my behalf, looked at my mother with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Not anger exactly, but the particular disappointment of someone realizing they'd been used as a prop in someone else's performance. You told me you were scared for her safety, Carol said slowly. You asked me to help find her. I was scared, my mother said, but her voice had lost its certainty. She lived 4 miles from you the whole time, Carol said. Denise, is that right? I hadn't realized Denise's name would come up like that, but I confirmed it simply. 4.2 miles. Same building the entire time. I reached back into the folder and pulled out one more page, the one I had hoped I wouldn't need to show, but the room had already opened the door to it. There's also this, I said, and I placed the police incident report on the table. Case number. Visible, dated 14 months earlier. A welfare check was requested for my apartment. It was closed as resident confirmed safe. An officer knocked on my door while I was working a night shift, and a neighbor confirmed I lived there. I have the case number if anyone wants to call and verify it themselves. The patio went completely silent, the kind of silence that has a texture to it, heavy and unfamiliar in a room that had spent the whole evening full of music and laughter. My mother's cousin, a quiet woman named Beth who rarely spoke at these gatherings, said softly, "You called the police on your own daughter and told us she was missing?" My mother didn't answer. She looked at the report, then at me, then at the growing circle of relatives who had drifted closer without quite meaning to. I didn't know what else to do, she finally said, her voice cracking for the first time all night. You stopped answering. I stopped answering requests for money, I said gently but clearly. I answered every birthday call. I answered Christmas. I was never hiding from you. I was just done funding a relationship that only existed when you needed something. My father set his drink down on the table, hard enough that a few heads turned. "This is exactly why we don't tell you things," he said, "because you turn it into a courtroom." "I didn't bring a courtroom," I said. "I brought receipts. There's a difference, and I think everyone here can see it." My father tried once more. Quieter now, almost pleading, a tone I had never heard from him before. "This isn't the place, Sarah." "You're right," I said. "It shouldn't have to be, but it's the only place you both ever actually listen." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I picked the papers back up, folded them, and sat back down at my table because I had said what I came to say, and the rest of the evening was no longer mine to manage. The truth doesn't need volume once it's been said out loud in front of the right people. It just needs time to settle. The days after the dinner were quieter than I expected, but not in the way silence used to feel in my family. This silence had weight to it, the kind that comes after something true finally gets said and can't be unsaid. My mother texted me the next morning, a single line. "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone," responded once calmly. "You didn't have to tell everyone I disappeared. I only corrected the record." She didn't respond after that. The drive home from the dinner was quiet. Priya's fiancé walked me to my car, and before I got in, he said, "For what it's worth, that was the calmest mic drop I've ever seen in my life." I laughed for the first time in weeks. A real laugh, not the polite kind I usually kept ready for family functions. I didn't sleep much that night, not out of dread, but out of something closer to disbelief. I kept replaying the moment my mother's hand hovered over the papers without touching them, and I realized that image would probably stay with me longer than any of the shouting ever could have. Word moves quickly through families once a story cracks open, and within 2 weeks, the version of events my parents had spent years constructing had fully unraveled among our relatives. Aunt Carol called me personally to apologize for ever doubting where I'd been, and admitted she'd felt uneasy about the missing persons comment for over a year, but hadn't wanted to question my mother directly. My cousin Priya told me that at least 6 relatives had privately reached out to her afterward. Embarrassed, they'd repeated the story about my disappearing without ever once trying to contact me themselves. There were consequences beyond the family too, quieter ones, but real. My father had used the story of his missing daughter as a sympathy narrative at his church for over a year, which had, according to my mother's sister, resulted in several fundraising gestures from congregation members, including a collection taken up for the family during a hard time. Once the truth came out, that support evaporated, not through anything I did, but through the natural consequence of a community realizing it had been misled. My father resigned from his position on the church's finance committee 2 months later. Nobody forced him. He simply couldn't stay somewhere his credibility had quietly dissolved. Daniel's supplement business, the one my parents had drained a home equity line of credit to fund, collapsed within the same season, unrelated to me directly, but no longer propped up by money I was no longer sending and my parents no longer had. He filed for a small business bankruptcy discharge on the remaining supplier debt, and for the first time in his adult life, faced a consequence that wasn't quietly absorbed by someone else. Daniel and I talked more in the months after that dinner than we had in the previous 5 years combined. He told me once, over coffee, that he used to resent how much I got away with by moving out young, not understanding until much later that what looked like freedom from the outside had just been a different kind of weight, one measured in bank transfers instead of expectations to succeed at something he never chose for himself. We didn't become close overnight, but we started being honest with each other, which was more than either of us had with our parents for most of our lives. He got a job managing inventory for a logistics company a few months later. Steady hours, no investors to answer to, no family, money propping up a dream that was never fully his to begin with. He told me it was the first job he'd ever had that nobody in the family had helped arrange, and that it felt strange to be proud of something so ordinary. I understood exactly what he meant. My relationship with my parents didn't resolve into something clean or easy. And I think it's important to say that honestly, because not every one of these stories ends with a perfect reunion, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. My father and I still speak rarely, mostly logistics, mostly short. He has never fully apologized, though he did say, once on a phone call about something unrelated, "I probably could have handled things differently over the years." That was as close as I've gotten, and for now, I've made peace with it being enough. My mother has tried harder, in fits and starts. She sends the occasional text just to check in, no request attached, and sometimes I answer right away, and sometimes I let a day pass first. Not out of punishment, but because I've learned that pacing is allowed now. I don't owe instant availability to earn the right to a relationship. I want to be honest, because this story isn't about celebrating anyone's downfall. I felt no satisfaction watching my father lose his committee seat, or Daniel lose his business. What I felt mostly was relief. The specific relief of no longer being the only person holding a version of the truth that everyone around me refused to see. Denise helped me formalize one more thing before the year was over. A simple, unemotional boundary letter sent to both my parents, stating clearly that I would no longer respond to financial requests, that any further public statements suggesting I was missing, unstable, or unreachable would be treated as defamation, and that I remained open to a relationship built on honesty, whenever they were ready for one. I never sent it in anger. I sent it the way I chart a patient's medication history, factually, without embellishment, because some truths only need to be written down once to matter. My mother called 4 months later, on a Tuesday evening, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. She didn't ask for money. She asked how I was doing. I told her the truth. I told her I was doing well, that my job was steady, that I'd finally bought the car I'd wanted at 22, 6 years late, but mine outright, no loan, no favor. Owed to anyone. She was quiet for a moment, then said, I don't think I ever really asked you that before. How you were doing? No, I said gently. You didn't. We didn't fix 4 years or 20 in that one phone call, but it was the first real conversation we'd had in longer than I could remember, one that didn't end with a number attached to. My apartment, the same one I'd lived in the entire time I was supposedly missing, is quiet now in a way I've come to love. No calls on the 1st and 15th of the month. No group chats I'm excluded from until someone needs to explain my absence. No folder growing heavier with evidence I never wanted to need. Just my own keys, on my own hook by the door, belonging to no one but me. I think a lot of people confuse boundaries with revenge, and I understand why, because from the outside, watching, consequences finally land on people who avoided them for years can look the same either way. But revenge wants someone to suffer. A boundary just wants the truth to be visible enough that you're never asked to disappear inside someone else's story. Again, I didn't set out to end my father's standing at his church, or Daniel's business, or the version of my mother that needed a missing daughter to explain her own choices. I set out to stop being erased. Everything else was simply what happens when 4 years of silence meets 4 weeks of documentation, and a room full of people finally willing to listen. Sometimes I think about that 14-year-old girl who never got her bicycle, and I wonder if she would recognize the woman who sat calmly at a banquet table and placed a police report next to a bowl of grilled vegetables without raising her voice once. I think she would. I think she spent years quietly building toward that moment without either of us fully realizing it, saving not just money but proof, not just distance but documentation, until the version of events that had been used against me for so long simply couldn't survive contact with the truth anymore. I still work the same job. I still take the same overnight shifts, still smell like antiseptic at the end of a long one, still sit in my car in that same hospital parking lot some nights just to breathe before driving home. But the phone calls that used to wait for me there don't come anymore, not the way they used to. And when my phone does buzz now, on a random Tuesday with no invoice attached, no emergency, no number owed, I've noticed I actually smile before I answer it. That's the part nobody tells you about. Setting a boundary, it isn't just what you remove from your life. It's what finally has room to exist once the noise is gone. So let me ask you something before you go. Have you ever had to prove your own life to the people who were supposed to know it best? Where do you draw the line between keeping the peace and disappearing into someone else's version of who you are? Tell me in the comments because I read every single one, and I promise you, your story matters here too. If this one hit close to home, do me a favor and hit like, subscribe if you're new, and share it with someone who needs to hear that boundaries aren't betrayal. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, and events are products of the imagination, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.